With the completion of Hosho in 1922, Japan did not only introduce the aircraft carrier into its navy, but also the island superstructure, which Hosho would only possess for roughly a year. Hosho's hull dimensions were deemed too constrictive for the ship to mount an island superstructure, and thus it was removed in 1923 in order to increase the ship's efficiency and safety when operating aircraft. Though the Japanese would do small tests with the island on Akagi, they would not fully reintroduce it until the completion of Soryu in 1937. Soryu, in many respects, was a game-changer in aircraft carrier development within the Imperial Japanese Navy. However, the Japanese still proved unsatisfied with the island, and they would test another type of island in a different position, and this would be seen on the next completed vessel, Hiryu. Hiryu and the rebuilt Akagi would be the only two Japanese aircraft carriers to have the island located on the port side of the vessel, halfway down the length of the flight deck, and this was done at the request of the Naval Air Department. There were two reasons they cited for wanting to test out the island further back on the flight deck on the port side. The first one being they believed that the island at the forward part of the flight deck messed with the airflow over the flight deck and created turbulence, which in turn made takeoff difficult. They also believed that the island at the forward end of the ship impeded the amount of flight deck available for takeoff, and thus they wanted to move the island further back so there was more flight deck available for takeoff, as they felt that landing aircraft did not need as much flight deck. As for the island's placement to port rather than starboard, this was not at the request of the Naval Air Department, but the designers had to work around the fact that the funnels were located just below the new island's proposed position, and since they could not place the supporting structure for the island where the funnels were sitting, they had to place the island on the opposite side of the ship. This did have the benefit of canceling out the mass of the island and funnel together, meaning no additional ballast was necessary. Before Akagi was to go through its fitting out stage, the Japanese decided to run a test, and they would construct a wooden mock-up of the island in its intended position and run the ship from Yokosuka to Sasebo. There were 4 points that the Japanese were testing during this run. They were looking to see the impact of takeoff and landing an aircraft, the airflow over the deck, and the capability of the navigation officers to steer the ship. The results regarding landing and takeoff were inconclusive. However, pilots preferred the position of Soryu and the newly reconstructed Kaga's Island to the forward-starboard flight deck rather than amidships on the port side. Airflow was another inconclusive result, and steering the ship was found preferable at the forward part of the ship so that the navigators could tell where the bow was from obstacles, specifically in ports. When this test was completed, Japan was constructing 2 new aircraft carriers. These would become Shokaku and Zuikaku, and their initial design called for the island to be placed on the port side amidships as seen on Hiryu. And as a result of these tests, it was decided to move the island back to 1/3 of the distance back from the flight deck's forward end on the starboard side. Now, this would be the most numerous type of island we would find on Japanese aircraft carriers. However, there was another type that the Japanese would introduce, and this was in 1942 aboard the Hiyo, which was a converted ocean liner. Only 4 islands to this design would be completed in the Japanese Navy. These were the 2 Hiyos, the 1 Taiho, and the 1 Shinano. In modern-day terms, this island is described as being a larger and more efficient space for crew members to work in. However, this is only a partial truth, as in reality, the back half of the island is occupied by the funnel and its uptakes. A couple of the island's upper decks did extend down and wrap around the inboard side of the funnel uptakes, but the functional impact this had on the island was minor. If the Japanese Navy was able to construct more aircraft carriers beyond Taiho and Shinano, we would have seen this island more often, as the follow-up designs did incorporate this type of island. Now, there is one thing that both types of islands had in common, and this was their lack of armor, which is understandable. And thus, the Japanese tried to come up with methods to compensate this, specifically when discussing machine gun rounds, as this was seen as the greatest threat to the island. There were 2 materials the Japanese would use to attempt stopping machine gun rounds from piercing the island bulkheads. This was ropes and rolled mattresses. People often mistaken the rolled mattresses for sandbags. However, if the sandbags were hit with machine gun shells, this would cause the sand to spill out all over the flight deck, and this would negate the purpose of having the sandbags on the island, and would also create a hazardous flight deck. With that being the developmental history behind the island, let's take a look at how the Japanese laid the island out for the most efficient platform, and for this I'm going to use Soryu as the basis. The upper level to the island is referred to as the upper bridge deck, though it is more popularly known as the spotting bridge. This level of the island was quite chaotic. There were a series of binoculars for spotting targets, the Type 94 high-angle fire control system, the Type 93 number 1 medium wave revolving loop antenna, a hand signal post, a 1.5 meter rangefinder, and a 2 kilowatt signal light. Moving down one deck, we are within the compass bridge. This possesses another set of binoculars, navigation equipment, and the information station for the Type 94 director located above. Moving down another deck, we enter the lower bridge platform. Here is located the ship's helm, along with more navigation equipment, a goniometer station, and the takeoff and landing control stations. Note there are 2 control stations for takeoff and landing. One is internal, and the other is an exposed platform. Moving down to the final level, we hit the flight deck, and within this level, there was the wireless telephone room, and the sea chart room and operations room. Now, the flight operations room was too small for the pilots to gather in before takeoff, and thus chalkboards were hung on the outside of the Japanese islands for the briefings to be given. Now, that is essentially the layout the Japanese would use on all of their aircraft carriers' islands, but there are some slight differences that I will discuss now, starting with Hiryu and Akagi, because those 2 islands were comprised of 5 decks rather than the standardized 4. Now, the functionality of the island remains the same. The decks that I've previously shown from the Soryu were all shifted up 1 level on Hiryu's bridge, and the flight deck level, as far as I can tell, was vacant. It essentially acted as a passageway to the decks above. I will admit that I'm not too comfortable with that, as finding information on the flight deck level of Hiryu and Akagi's island has been difficult. Another major alteration that was made to the islands was the position of the Type 94 high-angle fire control director, as later in the war, the Type 21 radar net would occupy the location the director had on Soryu. All of the Japanese carriers predating June of 1942 had the Type 94 director located atop the island, and this means that the 4 lost at Midway had the Type 94 directors instead of radar, but following Midway, the Type 21 radar would receive priority, and thus Shokaku and Zuikaku would have the director swapped out with the radar, and the director was relocated off the starboard side of the bridge on a sponson platform. The issue with the radar is that there was no plotting room for its information within the island, and thus information that the radar collected had to be manually called up to the navigation bridge. Those are the major alterations I'm going to mention about the islands. All other alterations that were made were minor and would effectively be an endless list if I were to get into them, especially when we get to the Unryu class. Speaking of the Unryu class, the United States would capture a couple of surviving vessels from this design, and upon inspecting the island, the United States would note that though the island was small in comparison to other navies, it was very well set up and thus was an effective structure in commanding a ship. The United States also considered the location of the island excellent, as its forward position, in most circumstances, did prove an excellent vantage point for navigation purposes, and it also provided an excellent 360 view, meaning that the binoculars designed to spot targets over the horizon were very well positioned. All in all, the islands aboard Japanese aircraft carriers were not flawless, but they proved to get the job done rather effectively. With that having been said, hopefully you have enjoyed today's video. If so, why not leave a like and comment down below, and have a wonderful day.